Hello and good morning. So what are we going to talk about today? In the last class we talked about India-Nepal relations. Right? So just give me a sense. Did you try and write the answer? Was there any difficulty that you faced in writing the answer to that question? मुश्किल हुई आपको? कंक्लूजन में प्रॉब्लम है. कंक्लूजन में क्या प्रॉब्लम है? चलिए यहीं से बात शुरू करते हैं. व्हाट इज द प्रॉब्लम इन कंक्लूजन? बोलिए. अच्छा, आपको समझ में नहीं आ रहा कि आप अपने कंक्लूजन में क्या लिख रहे हैं, तो ये तो फिर प्रॉब्लम कैसे सॉल्व कर सकते हैं हम? आपको खुद अपनी राइटिंग समझ में नहीं आ रही है. कंक्लूजन में ऐसा कुछ विशेष नहीं लिखना होता है, कोई फॉर्मूला नहीं है कंक्लूजन में लिखने का. देखिए मेरे हिसाब से वेन एवर यू पुट योर पेन टू द पेपर दैट इज योर इंट्रोडक्शन, एंड वेन एवर यू स्टॉप राइटिंग दैट इज योर कंक्लूजन. सो यू हैव टू थिंक that how are you going to complete this journey. So when you start writing, introduction generally provides the foreground for whatever you are going to write in the next part. So understand, introduction either can provide a background, introduction can provide a context, introduction can provide a gist of your argument as well, which you are going to present, and then the body part is always description of what has been asked. If it is analysis, then how do you describe that analysis? How do you write it? So that is that, and the conclusion is binding of the arguments, that you are binding. So suppose if a question is asking for your opinion, so then in one or two line you clearly state your opinion, whether it is a good relation, whether it is a bad relation. So we can say that, all right, or it can be argued. So that is something that you can do. Provide your opinion if opinion has been asked, because you have done the analysis, given the example. If the opinion has not been asked, then the simple way is to end on a positive note, on a solution oriented note. Simply say something positive about the relation or say something which is solution oriented. ये कर सकते हैं आप. And then some questions would ask about solutions explicitly. So sometimes an explicit conclusion is not required, because question would be in three parts. So third part would be suggest way forward, suggest solutions, suggest measures. तो वहां पे आपके पास कंक्लूजन के लिए टाइम नहीं बचता, तो आपने मेजर सजेस्ट कर दी. ये तीन चार तरीके से आप कर सकते हैं. बट डोंट गेट स्टक इन द प्रोसेस ऑफ थिंकिंग दैट अ वेरी गुड इंट्रोडक्शन और अ वेरी गुड कंक्लूजन इज व्हाट योर आंसर इज, बिकॉज मोस्ट ऑफ द पीपल जनरली आर स्टक हाउ टू स्टार्ट, हाउ टू एंड. दैट इज basically a mechanical way of getting stuck, because ultimately whatever you have to write in the middle part of the answer. That is where the substance is. So you can use jargons, for example in conclusion, either in the introduction or in the conclusion. You can start by saying simply that India-Nepal relations are special relations, right? So that is the way you begin, and you can end it with that also. You can save that phrase, and in the end you can write, so we can say, or it can be argued, that India-Nepal relations, though there are periodic frictions, remain special. All right, यही करेंगे. क्वेश्चन क्या था? क्वेश्चन क्या था? Okay, so in the case of India-Nepal relations, examine the Treaty of Friendship 1950 as a source of cooperation and contention. तो इसको कैसे करना है? सिंपल है. आपको ट्रीटी के बारे में तो लिखना ही है. आप भले ही कुछ और लिखे या ना लिखें, लेकिन आपको ट्रीटी के बारे में लिखना है ना. ट्रीटी के बारे में लिखे बिना कोई बात नहीं बनने वाली है. तो सबसे पहला काम क्या है? ट्रीटी के बारे में लिखना है. ट्रीटी के बारे में लिखा आपने, उसके बाद आपको क्या करना है? उसके बाद आपको अपना व्यू देना है. व्यू कैसा देना है? एक, नेपाल में लोग क्या सोचते हैं, व्हाट आर द आर्ग्यूमेंट्स इन नेपाल. और दूसरा व्यू क्या देना है? व्हाट इज इंडियाज पोजीशन, इंडिया क्या सोचता है इस बारे में. ऑलराइट, तो ये दो चीजें आपको करनी है, और उसके बाद आपको अपना कंक्लूजन देना है. और कंक्लूजन क्या होगा इस तरह के क्वेश्चन में? कंक्लूजन, क्योंकि इंडिया की फॉरेन पॉलिसी के बारे में आप लिख रहे हैं तो कंक्लूजन यही होगा जब तक गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया ये डिसाइड नहीं करे कि वो ट्रीटी रिवोक करने की जरूरत है, दैट दिस ट्रीटी रिमेन्स द फ्रेमवर्क ऑफ स्पेशल रिलेशंस बिटवीन इंडिया एंड नेपाल. दैट इज व्हाट वुड बी द कंक्लूजन. ऑलराइट, तो look at the question and just imagine what the question is demanding. So this question is simply demanding that you showcase your knowledge of important provisions of the Treaty of Friendship, and then you also showcase your knowledge of what India thinks and what are the contentions in Nepal. ये आपको करना है इस क्वेश्चन में. तो क्वेश्चन की रिक्वायरमेंट ये है. अब आप इंट्रोडक्शन में कुछ भी लिख लें, कंक्लूजन में कुछ भी लिख लें, अगर बीच के पार्ट में ये नहीं है, if the main part is missing, then it would not be a good answer. So you can show me your answer towards the end of the class. All right? So उस पे भी बात कर लेंगे. Now, anything else that you noticed about India-Nepal relations? Anything else that came to your mind? I always forget how to operate this board. Anything else that comes to your mind? Where is the notes? I can't find the notes. I go to the menu and then what do? Android. I go to Android. This is the sign of Android. And then what do? Oh, and I find it. Thank you. This is called cooperative learning, two-way learning, adaptive learning. I learned, right? It happens. I tend to forget easiest of things. And thank God I'm not writing examination. Right. Okay. I can understand your pain. यू आर राइटिंग एग्जामिनेशन, इतना सारा कैसे याद करें. याद करने का बहुत सिंपल तरीका होता है, फ्रेमवर्क बनाओ, कॉन्टेक्स्ट में याद करो. विदाउट अ कॉन्टेक्स्ट यू आर नॉट गोइंग टू रिमेंबर थिंग्स. सो दुनिया भर में बहुत ज्यादा नॉलेज है. फर्स्ट फ्रेमवर्क कॉन्टेक्स्ट कम्स फ्रॉम द सिलेबस, सेकंड फ्रेमवर्क कॉन्टेक्स्ट कम्स फ्रॉम द क्वेश्चन पेपर, राइट, एंड थर्ड इज हाउ वी डू इट इन द क्लास. एवरी सब्जेक्ट, एवरी टीचर वुड टेल यू अ सिंपल वे ऑफ लर्निंग. So that is basically what I would suggest to you. Then you are intelligent people, you have your own opinion, you can choose your own path. Today we are going to talk about two relations. One is with Sri Lanka, another is with Maldives. Myanmar तो नहीं कहा किसी ने. Maldives. Now just tell me, how are these two relations different from other relations that we have talked about so far? Strategic concerns. चलिए, अच्छा है आपने मुझे याद दिला दिया. ओके, तो कर लेते हैं. आप बताते जाइए क्या क्या करना है, मैं कराता जाऊंगा. ऑल राइट, यू आर ऑल्सो माई गाइड. सो वेन वी से स्ट्रैटेजिक, आई हैव टोल्ड यू, आई होप आई हैव टोल्ड यू, देयर इज अ वे ऑफ लुकिंग एट द टर्म स्ट्रैटेजिक. Strategic always refers to long-term concerns, long-term potential. So it has a temporal dimension, meaning it is about the long-term features of any phenomenon that we are talking about. Strategic in international relations generally is used in the sense of anything to do with military, security, or what is called grand strategy, long-term interest of foreign policy. So for any country, if you can identify 2 or 3 features which you can refer to as strategic, it would be good. And in most of the cases we can define defense interest as strategic. So that is not going to change, right? We had learned in the last class that since Nepal is in the Himalayas, traditionally India considers Himalaya to be the first line of defense. So in any phase, in terms of India's security and defense interests, Nepal is going to remain important. So that is first strategic feature in terms of relations with Nepal, that with a shared border, with a shared and open border, we had learned that it is also an open border, with a shared and open border, and also China as its another neighbor, with a shared and open border, and also with China as its other neighbor, Nepal has featured prominently in India's strategic thinking. With a shared and open border and China as its other neighbor, Nepal has featured prominently in India's strategic thinking. For example, since the 1962 war, since the 1962 war with China, Nepal's location and cooperation with it has been a key consideration in India's regional security approach. Has been a key consideration in India's regional security approach. Has been a key consideration in India's regional security approach. Now, changing the paragraph. Multiple actors or different actors in Nepal's politics. Different actors in Nepal's politics in different phases. Different actors in Nepal's politics in different phases seek to use relations with China to balance India's perceived dominance, This can be called the China card. In India-Nepal relations. This can be called the China card in India-Nepal relations. This can be called the China card in India-Nepal relations. In times of frictions between India and Nepal, China has acquired a greater space. In times of friction between India and Nepal, China has acquired a greater space in Nepal's foreign policy considerations. China has acquired a greater space in Nepal's foreign policy considerations. For instance, during the logjam of 2015, multiple domestic actors in Nepal. During the logjam of 2015, multiple domestic actors in Nepal argued for, multiple domestic actors in Nepal argued for a greater opening up with China. A greater opening up with China. This was further evident in, greater opening up with China, full stop, this was further evident in the then Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli. The then Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli's visit to China. KP Sharma Oli's visit to China. And signing of agreements on petroleum supply, as well as cross-border connectivity, China has also, in the recent decades, emerged as an important player. In the development of hydropower. China has also emerged as an important player in the development of hydropower in Nepal. Furthermore, changing the paragraph, furthermore, the 2019 visit of Xi Jinping. Furthermore, the 2019 visit of Xi Jinping underscored growing cooperation between the two countries. Underscored growing cooperation between the two countries with the announcement of an extradition treaty, एक्स्ट्राडिशन सुना है आपने? एक्स्ट्राडिशन, प्रत्यर्पण जिसको कहते हैं हिंदी में, विजय माल्या को लेके आएंगे, एक्स्ट्राडिशन ट्रीटी, and also commitment to build a multi-dimensional trans-Himalayan connectivity network. Also a commitment to build a trans-Himalayan multi-dimensional connectivity network as part of China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, as part of China's BRI. China also announced opening of Confucius Institutes. China also announced opening of Confucius Institutes. China also announced opening of Confucius Institutes in Nepal to promote better cultural ties. China also announced opening of Confucius Institutes to promote better cultural ties. To promote better cultural ties. Paragraph changed. Increasing space for China in Nepal's consideration. Increasing space for China in Nepal's considerations is a result of both countries being neighbors, both countries being neighbors with a shared border, both countries being neighbors with a shared border, B, Nepal as a landlocked and least developed country, Nepal as a landlocked and least developed country, Nepal as a landlocked and least developed country, seeking to diversify sources of development financing. Nepal as a landlocked and a least developed country seeking to diversify sources of its development financing. And third, political transition in Nepal. Political transition in Nepal resulting in a new generation of political class, resulting in a new generation of political class, resulting in a new generation of political class, advocating, new generation of political class advocating greater cooperation with China, advocating greater cooperation with China. For India, all this may mean A, an erosion of influence in its own neighborhood, an erosion of influence in its own neighborhood, which for long has been its traditional sphere of strategic influence, which for long has been a traditional sphere of strategic influence. Strategic influence. Strategic influence. B. Given the current logjam at the LAC, given the current logjam at the LAC, given the current logjam at the LAC, and a history of contentious relations with China, given the current logjam at the LAC and the history of contentious relations with China, its increasing presence in Nepal, its increasing presence in Nepal, its increasing presence in Nepal raises concerns regarding security matters, raises concerns regarding security matters, raises concerns regarding security matters. Thirdly, or C, endorsement by its neighbors, endorsement by its neighbors to China's BRI, endorsement by its neighbors to China's BRI, endorsement by its neighbor to China's BRI weakens India's stand on the matter, weakens India's stand on the matter. All right. So basically, what have we written in simple terms? What is the strategic element of this relationship? So all elements of this relationship are of strategic in nature. This is our neighbor. Neighbors are strategically important in any case, in general sense. Why? Because we share rivers, we share borders, we share people-to-people ties. So neighbors are going to be important for long term. This is not a relationship that is important one day and not important another day. Because simple fact, we cannot change our neighborhood. But specifically, if we look at the traditional meaning of strategic concerns, we find that the elements of shared borders make Nepal important for India's security consideration. For example, we in 1962 had sent our military representatives to Nepal in case of war with China. So in the future also, if there is any such situation, cooperation with Nepal would become important. It's such a strategically located country. Secondly, Nepal also shares a border with China, and traditionally India and China have had contentions. So what is happening currently is what has been a part of history. There have been occasions when every government in Nepal plays the China card, and it is nothing to blame them about. It's part of what countries would do. If you are small, you would like to have a larger friend so that you can balance the interest of two countries. Smaller countries would always like to play two larger countries to benefit. दोनों से फायदा मिले. So China card is already there, and generally it happens. All right, बुरा मानने की बात नहीं है. Don't feel offended by it. This is the nature of international relations. In the current phase, what we see that there are two factors: emergence of a newer generation of politicians. So 70 साल में क्या हुआ ये आप लोग पूछते हैं. वैसे नेपाल में भी यंग लोग पूछते हैं कि what our ancestors did, they mortgaged our interest to India. India became a dominant country. ऐसे सवाल आते हैं वहाँ उनके दिमाग में भी. तो क्या करना चाहिए? तो उनके दिमाग में आता है कि भाई China is also a neighbor. Let's open up with China. और China के पास आज ज़्यादा पैसा है. So emergence of newer generations of politicians. So political transition always is an occasion where such questions are raised. You are not satisfied with one स्टेटस यू वांट टू चेंज इट तो सॉल्यूशन बहुत सारे हैं, है ना. तो देन व्हाट इज हैपनिंग इज द सेकंड फैक्टर इज whenever there is friction in India Nepal relations, and be sure that there would always be periods of frictions in India Nepal relations, है ना. जब कहते हैं, जो एक ट्रेडिशनल कहावत है, जब दो बर्तन साथ में होते हैं तो बचते ही हैं. हम आसपास हैं, इश्यूज हैं हमारे बीच में, तो देयर वुड बी प्रॉब्लम्स, देयर वुड बी पीरियड्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन. So in these periods what happens is all these factors become more important. So thereby you would see 2015 as an example. 2015 constitution making of process of Nepal is coming to a completion. For various reasons this became a period of contention between India and Nepal, where there was an image issue for India in Nepal. So on that occasion what you find is that Nepal and China signed agreements for petroleum supply, whereas traditionally Nepal is 100% dependent on India for petroleum supply. जब 2015 में petroleum supply बंद हो गई तो फिर they had to think, so they signed agreements with China. They also signed agreements with border connectivity. So traditionally border with India is in the plains, so that's why flourishing ties between India and Nepal has been facilitated because of that factor. So now China is saying that we would develop border infrastructure with Nepal as well, including a highway from China to Nepal, including a railway from China to Nepal. So that is also there. Some work on that has started. We understand that there are other agreements in place. And then we understand political visits. For example, 2019 Xi Jinping visited Nepal. On that occasion, he gave a very strong speech that anyone who dares to go against the interest of China would be total lesson. हड्डियां तोड़ देंगे हम, ऐसा उन्होंने कहा. Basically, he was referring to there are a lot of Tibetan refugees who live in Nepal, and China is very sensitive about anyone talking about Tibet's independence. So extradition treaty इसीलिए नेपाल के में तिब्बत के एक्टिविस्ट को पकड़ के चाइना भेजने के लिए. ऑल राइट, क्योंकि इंडिया तो भेजेगा नहीं. तो that is something that we saw, that Nepal has shown an understanding for China's concerns. And then we also see that connectivity between Nepal and China has a larger dimension. Nepal believes that since it is located right in the middle, in the future it can be the transit hub for trade between India and China. So China and Nepal are together working on what is called multi-dimensional trans-Himalayan connectivity project. रेल रोड प्रोजेक्ट जैसे हमने सीपीएससी में देखा था. सो दैट इज पार्ट ऑफ बीआरआई. एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स इंडिया वुड नॉट एग्री टू यूज दैट पर्टिकुलर रूट, बट दैट इज एन एग्जांपल ऑफ हाउ प्रोग्रेस इज बीइंग मेड. एंड इन द लास्ट डिकेड what we found was different government awarded contracts to Chinese companies to build hydropower plants. So in simple sense it is a competition for influence, right? Influence is a limited commodity. Either you maintain good relations with Nepal or you give it away to China, you cede the space to China. So this is something that is happening. China also wants to engage with Nepal, so Confucius Institutes to teach Chinese, to create cultural familiarity. So China is making a pitch for improved relations with Nepal, and there are objective conditions in Nepal which also facilitate that. So for India, the concern, what is the concern? And this is the most important part. Our concern is not that China and Nepal are becoming friendly. Our concern comes from the fact what can be the implications. So first of all, neighborhood first. We consider our neighborhood to be our first strategic sphere of influence. So China coming in there poses a competition. It erodes your influence. It may come at the cost of your influence. What else? We have currently a standoff on the LAC. So we have tensional relations. We know we have traditionally contentious relations. One part of India-China relation is that. So in the future, if this escalates, then China's greater presence or greater say in Nepal would be a problem for India in terms of its security preparedness. And then we have certain principled stand against China-sponsored connectivity projects like BRI. But what matters is how acceptable is our stand. So if our neighbors accept and endorse China's BRI, we basically would be losing support on this matter. That देखो तुम्हारे पड़ोसी ही तुम्हारी बात नहीं सुनते हैं. So that is, these are the ways in which we can see what is happening. Now we have to understand that you cannot ask Nepal to not do these things. Nepal is a sovereign country. Problem यही रही है नेपाल में कि there is a perception that India interferes. So you cannot, जैसे आप लोगों के मन में ख्याल आता हो, बहुत सारे लोगों के मन में, इंडिया इतना बड़ा देश है, हमको प्रेशर डालना चाहिए, हम क्या कर सकते हैं? भाई कई सिचुएशन में ये मान के चलो लाइफ में कुछ नहीं कर सकते. Be comfortable with uncertainty. That is what I am saying. So first of all, we have to understand that it is because of the nature of Nepal's politics. So Nepal has the right to decide what it wants. Secondly, Nepal is a landlocked country. For the longest part, it was the least developed country. So it requires anywhere between 27 to 32 billion US dollars to adequately develop its infrastructure, because much of Nepal is also a Himalayan country, which means difficulty of terrain. So one way of moving out of poverty is, or develop, is to improve infrastructure. तो उसके लिए पैसा चाहिए. Nepal does not have the money. Where would that money come from? नहीं, केवल चाइना नहीं, जनरली डेवलपमेंट फाइनेंस के कुछ तरीके होते हैं. व्हाट आर दी वेज इन विच, आपने इकोनॉमी पढ़ी होगी, व्हाट आर द वेज इन विच अ कंट्री मोबिलाइजेज इट्स. सवाल पूरा करने दो, प्लीज लेट मी कंप्लीट. आई नो दैट यू नो, आई कंसिडर ऑल ऑफ यू टू बी IAS, IFS, वॉट एवर यू वॉन्ट टू बिकम, बट हियर आई एम प्लेइंग अ रोल, राइट? So I'm asking you a question. So here's the question. So what are the ways in which a country mobilizes resources for the purpose of its development? अब जिसको भी आंसर देना है, प्लीज रेज योर हैंड एंड स्टार्ट. इतने सारे लोग जो एक साथ बोल रहे थे. एनीवन, एनी वॉलंटियर्स? लोन, ग्रांट. लोन ग्रांट तक मैं आपसे एग्री करता हूं. डोमेस्टिक क्या है? ठीक है, आप सही बोल रहे हैं, मैं यही कह रहा हूं. नेशनल इनकम एंड अकाउंटिंग आपने पढ़ा होगा ना, राइट? सो एवरी गवर्नमेंट नीड्स बोरोइंग्स, इंटरनल बोरोइंग्स, एक्सटर्नल बोरोइंग्स. उसके अलावा अपने रिसोर्सेज हैं टैक्सेशन रिसिप्ट्स और डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट रिसिप्ट्स और ऑक्शंस, लाइक स्पेक्ट्रम ऑक्शन ये है. तो ये डोमेस्टिक रिसोर्सेज हो गए, बट नॉट एवरी कंट्री हैज इनफ डोमेस्टिक रिसोर्सेज. सो बोरोइंग्स आर रिक्वायर्ड, इंटरनल बोरोइंग, एक्सटर्नल बोरोइंग. And generally external borrowing would be from either what are called multilateral development banks like World Bank, IMF. It would come with a lot of conditionalities, international loan and grant, Astha is saying. So basically multilateral development banks, IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, New Development Bank, NDB. So new or old, traditional or new, multilateral development bank. Second source, कहां से दूसरी जगह से पैसा लाएंगे? इंडिया बहुत सारे देशों को डेवलपमेंट असिस्टेंस देता है, इंडिया को भी डेवलपमेंट असिस्टेंस मिलता है. सो सेकेंड सोर्स इज फ्रॉम सोवरेन गवर्नमेंट्स, राइट? इन टर्म्स ऑफ ODA, what is called ODA, ओवरसीज डेवलपमेंट असिस्टेंस. सो ये एक सोर्स हो गया. तीसरा सोर्स हो गया प्राइवेट सेक्टर, FDI. ऑलराइट, FDI. या इफ नॉट FDI, देयर इज अनदर वे. यू मस्ट हैव हर्ड दैट वी गो टू लंदन फाइनेंशियल मार्केट्स में हम बॉन्ड रेज करते हैं, मसाला बॉन्ड्स, सुना है आपने? सो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बोरोइंग, प्राइवेट सेक्टर फाइनेंसिंग, यहां से आ सकता है पैसा. और ये सारे ही एडिक्वेट नहीं है. प्राइवेट सेक्टर पैसा नहीं देगा इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बनाने के लिए, बिकॉज इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर इज अ लॉन्ग जेस्टेशन प्रोजेक्ट, है ना? पैसा लगाते हो, पैसा निकालने में टाइम लगता है. फ्लैट्स बेचने की बात नहीं कर रहा हूं मैं इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर की बात कर रहा हूं, राइट? सो प्राइवेट सेक्टर एक लिमिटेड ऑप्शन है. मल्टीलेटरल डेवलपमेंट बैंक एक लिमिटेड ऑप्शन है, कंडीशनैलिटीज के साथ आएगा. और ODA एक ऑप्शन बचता है. इसका मतलब है कि आपको सारे ही सोर्सेज से चाहिए. यू नीड फाइनेंसिंग फ्रॉम ऑल दीज सोर्सेज. सो दैट्स वेयर इन्फ्लुएंशियल कंट्रीज ऑल्सो हैव डेवलपमेंट असिस्टेंस एज देयर पॉलिसी. सो या तो आप दे दीजिए या फिर चाइना दे रहा है, राइट? सो यू कैनॉट से दैट यू डोंट फुलफिल योर नीड्स. Nepal has legitimate needs. As a developing country or least developed country and as a landlocked country. So this is something that we cannot say that don't do it. So then what is India's response? अब हम उस part पे पहुंचे जहाँ पे हम way forward कहते हैं. What is India's response? What should India do? What should India do? So अब हम last part पे पहुंच गए. अब हम कहने वाले how to manage this relationship. So what should be India's response? Huh? Project implementation करना चाहिए इनका कहना है. Or anyone else? Yes sir. What should India do to manage its relations with Nepal? Speak. The stage is yours. Nobody is going to say anything. I just want an affirmation from you that I am reaching out to you. Any one point? No, okay, we will talk later. Right, I will not force you. So what should India do? Provide development assistance to Nepal. Provide loans to the Nepal. पीछे से, what should India do? What should India do? Build credible relation. I am very happy that somebody spoke from the back. Right, I want you to be comfortable, but also participate. So yes, all of you are right. So if you see what is happening, what the government is doing, and if you have understood what kind of relation we have with Nepal, that is what we should be doing. Right? There is no new solution that is emerging. So what we can say is that as a final thing, just write it. The key to responding to any challenges in India-Nepal relations, including the key to responding to any challenges in India-Nepal relations, including the China factor, lies in strengthening the traditionally special ties. Lies in strengthening the traditional special ties. Lies in strengthening the traditional special ties. For this purpose, it is important that sensitivities of both sides are clearly spelled and clearly addressed. Sensitivities of both sides are clearly spelled and addressed. Clearly spelled and addressed. This can be done through the following. One, regular engagements at the highest level. To set the tone and direction Regular engagements at the highest level to set the tone and direction. For example, the recent visit by the two prime ministers. For example, the recent visit by the two prime ministers. So that is the one meaning, right? Prime Minister Modi was in Nepal and the Nepalese Prime Minister was in India most recently. So this is something that should happen, because at times what has happened, there has been a long passage between prime ministerial visits. So that is something that needs to be ensured, because that is what decides the direction, the tone of relations. Second, regularizing interactions at forums like India Nepal Joint Commission. Regularizing interactions at forums like India Nepal Joint Commission. India Nepal Joint Commission, which was established in 1987. Regularizing interactions at forums like India Nepal Joint Commission, which was established in 1987, yet has held only 6 meetings so far. Yet has held only 6 meetings so far. 6 meetings so far. So I had mentioned India Nepal Joint Commission as the platform where foreign ministers interact and review the entirety of relations. So 1987 till now only 6 meetings, that is not good. So it should be regularized. Now it is happening at a regular basis. So that is something that should happen. Thirdly, engagement between the armed forces. Engagements between the armed forces through joint training and exercise. Through joint training and exercise. Need to be promoted. Need to be promoted. Joint training and exercise need to be promoted. Next point. People to people ties. People to people ties has been an important layer of India-Nepal engagements. People to people ties has been an important layer of India-Nepal ties. In this context, it is important to engage with the younger generation. In this context, it is important to engage with the younger generation. In this context, it is important to engage with the younger generation to create a favorable narrative, about these ties, to create a favorable narrative about these ties, This can be done through increasing the number of scholarships provided by bodies such as ICCR. Increasing the number of scholarships provided by bodies such as ICCR to Nepalese students or to students from Nepal. Provided by bodies such as ICCR ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, ICCR, provided to students from Nepal. Change the paragraph. There are certain key areas. There are certain key areas in which progress can create an interdependence, between the two sides. One, between the two sides. One, geographical contiguity is a shared resource. Geographical contiguity is a shared resource which needs to be harnessed. Geographical contiguity is a shared resource which needs to be harnessed by promoting better connectivity between the two sides. Better connectivity between the two sides. Here progress needs to be ensured. Here progress needs to be ensured by implementing the agreements on railway connectivity, and inland waterway connectivity, as agreed between the two sides in 2018. Inland waterway connectivity as agreed between the two sides in 2018. In this context, the recent inauguration of Jayanagar Kurtha. In this context, the recent inauguration of Jayanagar Kurtha rail line or Jayanagar Kurtha rail track is a promising start. Furthermore, more projects of connectivity, like the Motihari Amlekganj pipeline, and Muzaffarpur Dhalkebar transmission line, ढाल के बाद ट्रांसमिशन लाइन need to be identified and implemented. More projects like Motihari Amlekganj pipeline and Muzaffarpur Dhal ke baad transmission line needs to be identified and implemented. Needs to be identified, implemented. Further increasing the number of ICPs. Further increasing the number of ICPs, integrated checkposts. Further increasing the number of ICPs, integrated checkposts, would go a long way, in transforming cross-border relations, in transforming cross-border relations, in transforming cross-border relations. Cultural links between the two sides, cultural links between the two sides, through the promotion of projects like development of Ramayana circuit, through the development of projects like development of the Ramayana circuit, through the projects like development of the Ramayana circuit, Ayodhya Janakpur bus service, Ayodhya Janakpur bus service, and funding the construction of a stupa, and funding the construction of a stupa, and funding the construction of a stupa at Lumbini, and funding the construction of a stupa at Lumbini need to be promoted, Expediting the implementation of announced projects, expediting the implementation of announced projects in the hydropower sector, expediting the implementation of hydropower projects, announced projects in the hydropower sector, such as Arun 3, and 4, such as Arun 3 and 4, would establish India's credibility. Expediting the implementation of projects in the hydropower sector such as Arun 3 and 4 would establish India's credibility and pave the way for expanded cooperation, in this sector, sector. To sum up, the need is to develop a relation based on mutual equality, based on mutual equality, mutual trust, mutual equality, mutual trust, and mutual benefit. Mutual equality, mutual trust, and mutual benefit. This may require changes in the existing arrangements and agreements. This may require changes in the existing arrangements and agreements. Changes in the existing arrangements and agreements, including the Treaty of 1950, including the Treaty of 1950. Openness, full stop, openness and flexibility, openness and flexibility and measures such as the ones openness and flexibility and measures such as the ones suggested by the eminent persons group, suggested by the eminent persons group appointed by the two countries, suggestions by the eminent persons group appointed by the two countries in 2014, appointed by the two countries in 2014, could provide the formula for the future, could provide the formula for the future. So basically EPG, Eminent Persons Group, was constituted in 2014 to review all the existing agreements between India and Nepal. It included retired diplomats from India and Nepal, academicians from India and Nepal. So it was a civil society group which was created by both India and Nepal. In 2014, it submitted its report in 2018. So it has suggested that the agreements should be revised to bring them up to the requirement of the current era. The report is yet not public, but we can say that this was one initiative that both countries has put in place to make changes. So their report and their suggestion can be the way forward. But we must remember that mutual equality, mutual benefit is the formula in this relation. Mutual equality from both sides. Mutual benefit, both sides should benefit. Non-interference, India should not be seen as interfering. India should adopt a hands-off approach. Sensitivities there should be there from both sides. From both sides. India is sensitive about what China is doing. Nepal is sensitive about how we treat them, right? Sometimes we have a stereotype of people from Nepal. हमारे सिनेमा में जैसे दिखाते हैं. So that is not the right way of respecting our neighbors. है ना, आपके भी stereotypes होंगे लोगों के बारे में, हम सभी के होते हैं. Stereotypes about people. So that is not good. People in Nepal don't like it. Right? People in Nepal don't like the overbearing attitude कि आपने मदद की है तो आप बार बार बताते रहें कि आपने मदद की है. So that is, sensitivity is required, because it is not only your size, it is not only your power that would matter. It would how you make other people feel. That would also matter. All right. There are thousands of IAS in the country. How many of you know? Do you know? How many of you can you name? or how many of them are remembered? Hmm? Who is the current cabinet secretary of India? जोर से बोलिए. राजीव गौबा जी की बात कर रहे हैं आप. ठीक है, चलिए आपको एक नाम याद है. बट यू वुड रिमेंबर पीपल लाइक टी.एन. सेशन. You will remember who was the most instrumental figure in the unification of India apart from Vallabhbhai Patel? Who was his secretary? V.K. Menon. He was also a civil servant. Right? So basically, if you think that only entering the service is the end of life, ho gaya to bas, so that is fine. Whatever gives you satisfaction. But if you want to do something more, then you would have to add to your personality, tact, sensitivity, right? How to deal with different situations, flexibility, openness, right? And that is what is required in other relations also. So सबसे पहले jump करना कि India is a large country, हमको ऐसा pressure करना चाहिए, ये करना चाहिए, is a trigger happy reaction. Think what can be different ways of dealing with that country, and always put the extreme step towards the end. Extreme steps towards the end. So ये आपको समझने की जरूरत है, right? V.K. Menon, Rajiv Gauba, so Adishwar, Shailendra, Shahbaz, Vishwesh. I can see your points that you are participating. Right, good. Any questions? Any questions? काफी लिख लिया आप लोगों ने आज, हैं? Challenge ये है that you go and highlight and basically build a formula for India-Nepal relations on the basis of this, which can be replicated in the examination. All right? Now, the next relation that we are going to talk about is relation with Sri Lanka and Maldives. So I had asked you a question, why and how these relations are different from other relations that we have talked about so far. Astha has made a suggestion using BBIN, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal project to increase infrastructure projects. So that can also be added, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal project, right? So that is correct. Have you heard of BBIN? Current affairs में BBIN cover हुआ है. So BBIN is also an example where you can talk about, right? Okay, so how is the relation with Nepal, or how is the relation with Maldives and Sri Lanka different from the relations that we have talked about so far? Water boundary पानी की बनी हुई है. थोड़ा सही मतलब come to the correct usage. They are neighbors in the Indian Ocean, right? So for example, Anshuman from the online part says we don't share land borders with those countries and they are important from point of view or position in the Indian Ocean. Good, that is what is being mentioned by others in the class also, right? So these are the countries with whom we share a maritime boundary. We don't share a land boundary, all right? So these are our maritime neighbors in the Indian Ocean region. That is what makes them different and important, that they are our maritime neighbors. And in our consideration, Indian Ocean is both part of our immediate neighborhood as well as a bridge that links India with other different faraway regions. So if you look at it, west coast of India and east coast of Africa are linked by the Indian Ocean. Similarly, most of our relations in Southeast Asia are through the Bay of Bengal. All right, through the Bay of Bengal, which is another important part of Eastern Indian Ocean. So that basically makes these neighbors important, that they are neighbors, they are in the Indian Ocean region. So then when we are talking about these neighbors, either Maldives or Sri Lanka, there is certain common things about them that we would remember, right? Both of them are India's maritime neighbors in the immediate neighborhood of South Asia. We have other maritime neighbors also. So for example, with Indonesia, with Thailand, we share a maritime boundary close to the Andaman and Nicobar. So maritime neighbors, where in the larger Indian Ocean region, the IOR as it is called, Indian Ocean region. So they are Indian Ocean region island states. Indian Ocean region island states. And islands are important in the ocean. Whatever piece of land you find in the ocean, it becomes important, especially if that land is close to busy shipping routes, right? So I'm not talking about Galapagos Island. I'm talking about island located in the Indian Ocean, and this is a region in which you will find east to west, west to east trade taking place, right? So why are these countries important? These countries are important because of their proximity to what are called sea lanes of communication, because of their proximity to trade routes. So thereby they become important from the perspective of larger maritime security interests, right? So if India has to think about its interests in the oceans, India generally has to think about cooperation with such countries. So these countries, Indian Ocean island countries like Sri Lanka and Maldives, become important because A, they are India's maritime neighbors located in the Indian Ocean region. B, their proximity to sea lanes of communication and their proximity to trade routes make them important from the perspective of economic security as well as larger maritime security. That's basically something that you should remember. And then in the context of these countries, we generally talk about A, that they are a special focus under India's neighborhood first, approach, as well as India's Sagar approach. All right, they are important focuses under India's neighborhood first approach as well as India's Sagar approach. Sagar simply means security and growth for all in the region, right? So I have an educated audience. Security for growth for all in the region, meaning India has a policy in the Indian Ocean region whereby it is committed to develop cooperative arrangements in the area of economy, in the area of security with the Indian Ocean countries. That is what India is saying, that we would like to promote cooperation for security and for economic progress in the Indian Ocean region. Security and growth for all in the region is what India is committed to. So that's where these countries become important. So whenever you are talking about these countries, remember these terms. These terms should be remembered, that you would be talking about neighborhood first, you would be talking about Sagar as I mentioned, you would be talking about maritime location of these countries, proximity to sea lanes of communication, proximity to trade routes, and thereby they are important in the context of larger maritime security considerations of India. So understand, geographically, countries focus on two planks. One is continent, another is oceans. Traditionally in India's foreign policy, the continental side was more important because that is where our most important problems came from, Pakistan and China. So land focus was more. Now, increasingly globally, maritime domain is becoming important. Countries have capability to define their interests beyond their region. India also, as it grows, it would define its interests beyond its own immediate region. And then more and more trade is now ocean based. More and more import of energy is ocean based. So then largely oceans would become important in the foreign policy of countries. We are seeing it all around us, and we find that the importance of strategically located islands for countries would also rise. That is something that is happening, right? This is something that people had theorized about quite back. So Mackinder and Mahan, have you heard of these two names? Mackinder and Mahan? नहीं, बहुत सारे लोग ये टर्म आजकल बात करते रहते हैं. So Mackinder talks about the heartland theory, meaning those who control Eurasia would be global power. Eurasia क्या है? The continuous landmass between Europe and Asia, जहां पे सबसे prominently कौन located है? Russia. All right, but we are also part of Eurasia. So Mackinder said heartland, the one who controls the heartland, the Eurasian landmass, would be the most important power. That's why US is interested in Europe. Russia is located there. Russia is also interested there. And then there is Alfred Thayer Mahan, right? Mackinder, Mahan. So Mahan said that world island, those who control world island, meaning oceans, would be the great power. So Mackinder basically talked about land, and Mahan talked about the oceans. So generally this is a traditional way of thinking. What are the domains of power projection? What are the domains through which generally trade passes? So how should countries be thinking about their defense preparedness, either on the land or on the oceans? So whenever we talked about land-based countries, we talked about a long shared border. That is a matter of sensitivity from the perspective of security, from the perspective of defense. When we are talking about these countries, we are talking about a larger domain, that these are not only important from the perspective of our own shared boundaries with them, but they are also important from the perspective of safety of global trade, right? They are also important in the context of India. If India wants to become a major power in the Indian Ocean, it has to be doing so in cooperation with these countries, right? So that is something that you should not forget. Let's talk about India-Sri Lanka relations. India-Sri Lanka relations. So again, this is one relation where you would find that the relations primarily are based on cultural and civilizational interactions, that we have cultural and civilizational interactions or ties. So that is one fundamental of this relation, that we share cultural and civilizational values. So either this can be seen in the form of the shared Buddhist heritage, So thereby we can say that India-Sri Lanka relations are more than 2,500 years old, right? This is a relationship that we trace back to 2,500 years. Some people would like to trace it back to the period of Ramayana, but I cannot date Ramayana. All right, that is my inability. So I would say that is part of the shared heritage. But we have an emperor by the name of Ashoka. Ashoka the Great is a key figure in India's civilizational history. And Ashoka the Great is important in terms of expansion of Buddhist influence. All right. So he sent his son Mahinda, Prince Mahinda or Prince Mahendra to Sri Lanka, but also Princess Sanghamitra to Sri Lanka. right? So that is where Buddhism took root in Sri Lanka. So that's why we can say that 2500 years old relation. But we also see that we have multiple interactions with Sri Lanka. So one is the mythological element, as we find in the great epic of Ramayana, right? That is one way in which we know Sri Lanka. Another way is, if you look at India's history, many of the southern empires, emperors, kingdoms, Cheras, Cholas, had made a visit to Sri Lanka. And when they made a visit to Sri Lanka, that was for ruling. So the ruling dynasties of southern India had a significant impact on Sri Lanka historically. So that was another exchange that you see happened between India and Sri Lanka, right? And then we also find that there is a certain sharedness which comes from the shared colonial rule. Britishers ruled India, Britishers ruled Sri Lanka also, right? Britishers ruled Sri Lanka also. So common political structures, political practices emerged, and then we find that this then translates into a shared ethnicity also. Shared ethnicity means there are certain communities which are important communities on both sides. So the Tamil community is an important part of the diversity of India, the great state of Tamil Nadu. And then Tamil community also is an important part of Sri Lanka, right? So we have a shared ethnicity. Even the largest ethnic community in Sri Lanka, which is the Sinhala community, it also shares a commonality with India, right? Many people would say that the language Sinhala has much in common with Sanskrit, or some theories are that the Sinhala people originated from somewhere in Odisha, all right, or at least they have ethnic linkages with India. So be it the Tamil community, be it the larger Buddhist religious community, be it the Sinhala community, India and Sri Lanka have commonality. For example, one of my Sri Lankan friends asked me, what do you call globalization in Hindi? I said globalization is called, what is globalization called in Hindi? वैश्वीकरण, भूमंडलीकरण भी कहते हैं. So he told me, oh, in Sinhala we call it गोल मंडलीकरण. All right. So you can trace the commonality between the two sides. So that is one way of saying that this relationship is based on cultural and civilizational interactions, intellectual interactions dating back to more than 2500 years. We also share linkages of ethnicity where Tamil is an important community, important spoken language on both sides, right? Similarly, ethnic communities like Sinhala also share commonality with the people in India, including linguistic commonalities. So that is one level of interaction. Similarly, at the political and diplomatic level, we have had close interactions through the meetings of the two leaders or leaders from both the countries, right? So we have the India-Sri Lanka peace accord, for example, an important piece of agreement of 1987, India-Sri Lanka peace accord. So we have had regular interactions at the highest level between both the sides. We have had agreements like India-Sri Lanka peace accord of 1987. We have in recent times summit, for example 2020 summit between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa of Sri Lanka. All right. So this is another set of interactions that we have, and then there is regular meeting of foreign secretaries, foreign minister visits Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has been in news over the last 2 years and generally is in news in India's newspapers or news cycle through these visits. And then we have close economic ties. So here we find that India-Sri Lanka trade is governed by an FTA which came into existence in the year 2000. So this is the first South Asian country with which India signed a free trade agreement. Right? First individual country with which India signed a free trade agreement in the year 2000. And then we have close development cooperation with this country also. So we have significant trade interactions, we have significant development engagements with Sri Lanka as well. And then we also find that we have close security interactions with this country. So for example, we have exercises like SLINEX, all right? Exercises like SLINEX, or exercises like Mitra Shakti, or we have a common participation in what is now called Colombo Security Conclave. Colombo Security Conclave. So if you look at India-Sri Lanka relations, these are some of the aspects that are the core of the cooperation. One, any official document always emphasizes on cultural and civilizational ties. So initiatives in India-Sri Lanka relations also focus on cultural and civilizational ties. For example, 2020, the international airport at Kushinagar was inaugurated. Kushinagar का नाम सुना है आपने? So why is Kushinagar known for? A place where Buddha achieved Mahaparinirvana, spent last days of his life. So that is a well-known place of Buddhist pilgrimage. So the airport now is the international airport. So on that occasion, the first flight to Kushinagar airport came from Sri Lanka, carrying a delegation from Sri Lanka, right? So that is the tie that we generally talk about, right? Then Sri Lanka has temple of Buddha's tooth relic. So we share relics associated with Buddha. We share relics associated with Buddha from time to time, right? So those interactions are also there. And there is regular pilgrimage by Sri Lankans to India to different Buddhist sites. Specifically, if you go to Bodh Gaya in Bihar, you will find a lot of communities, not only Sri Lankans, but also people from Myanmar, people from Thailand, people from Japan, and other parts of Southeast Asia. So that's always a part. Similarly, we have sought to engage with Sri Lanka regularly. We focus on it through the neighborhood first approach, through the Sagar approach. There are regular meetings. We have some agreements like India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987, which has come out of this particular process. Economic engagements. Traditionally, India has been the largest trading partner of Sri Lanka. Traditionally, in recent years, the second largest, right? Because the largest is now China. But traditionally, largest trading partner. But this relationship is also special because with Sri Lanka, we signed our first free trade agreement in South Asia. So that would be there. We have also tried to negotiate an ETCA with Sri Lanka, which is Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement, Economic and Technology Cooperation Agreement, ETCA, to expand the FTA. That has not been successful. Sign nahi kar paye hum. But we wanted to expand free trade agreement with Sri Lanka as well. Development cooperation, from the development of infrastructure to helping who are called internally displaced people in Sri Lanka. That is part of India's narrative. When we look at Sri Lanka, we find that it is in our maritime neighborhood. So, for larger maritime security of India, close security relations have always been important. This has been ensured through regular exercise with Sri Lankan Navy called SLINEX, or between the militaries called Mitra Shakti, or through dialogues such as Colombo Security Conclave. Now, the other part of this relation generally is the contention on the issues of ethnic ties and also strategic concerns on China. Strategic concerns on China. So, that's the larger part of the agenda. Concerns are related with certain elements of ethnic ties, which become political and diplomatic issue between India and Sri Lanka. And in recent times, our strategic concerns are related with the larger maritime domain, but more importantly, with the way in which China is emphasizing on the Indian Ocean region. China is giving importance to the Indian Ocean region, and thereby China is developing its stakes in Sri Lanka. So we are always concerned. कुछ news में आया recently? Sri Lanka allowed a Chinese ship to dock at Hambantota airport, naval ship. And Sri Lanka also allowed a Pakistani ship to dock in one of its ports. So the presence of any foreign navy close to India, specifically in Sri Lanka, is always a sensitive issue for India. So right now this is only episodic, but given the location of Sri Lanka, if it becomes a permanent feature, so that would mean that it brings closer to us a foreign adversarial power. So India is always sensitive. India would always convey to Sri Lanka that this is a sensitive issue for us, and that is why the newspapers would always talk about it. Right? So that's how you see India-Sri Lanka relations. Here we'll take a break, the favorite part of class for you. And after the break, we continue with India-Sri Lanka relations. And we take questions if there are any. And there is an online question, that is something that we'll also take. Right? So here is a break. Okay, we are back from the break. If there are any questions, so first of all, the question is online. Adishwar asks, sir, in today's time when economics is of so much importance and is the main driving force for centuries and people, does culture, ethnicity, etc., rather than having a soft corner on both sides, but does it play a very important role actually, or is economic dominant over them? So it was a very complicated question, but simple intent is, if economics is important, if economic interests are important, how much culture or people to people ties are relevant today? So first of all, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a zero-sum game that if economic interests are important, then cultural interests are not important. It's a traditional way of looking at any relationship. We try to find what are the elements. So first of all, it's a way of talking about any relationship. When we mention culture, civilization, we are not saying that it is going to change everything. We are saying that this is one element that should not be ignored. Why? Because official documents talk about it like that. So we should be cognizant of how generally relations are talked about. Look at any document of MEA, it would say cultural and civilizational ties. So one mechanical reason why we talk about cultural, civilizational, people to people ties, because without that, discussion of any relation is not complete. And it is not to say that there is nothing there. Of course, cultural interactions are there, government to government interactions, business to business interactions are important, but we cannot forget tourism, students, pilgrimage. They are important part of what links two countries. So then, it is a part of the entire spectrum of relations. All right, it is one part of the spectrum of relations, culture and civilization. Now, it is understood that soft power generally can smoothen the ground for difficult issues to be addressed. It can create a ground, it can create a context. Why? Because suppose somebody asks you for 500 rupees. If you know the person, आपके गांव से, आपके शहर से, आपकी लैंग्वेज बोलता है, you would be more comfortable as compared to somebody whom you don't know, somebody who comes from far away land, right? So that is basically what culture or soft power does. It creates the ground, the basis for cooperation in defense, cooperation in economy. So no matter, no doubt that economy is important, technology is important, security is important, but another layer of cooperation is cultural and civilizational. And on the basis of culture and civilizational engagements, we can say there is trust in relations. And when there is trust in relation, difficult issues of economy, difficult issues of security and defense can be easily addressed, right? So अगर इसको theory में ले जाएं, तो realists would say that only material power matters, right? Countries are rational actors and they are always looking at improving their position, and if somebody else's position improves, then they look at it as a loss. All right? Realist. Constructivist कहेंगे anarchy is what you make of it. Meaning the world is selfish, but ultimately what you mean by selfishness is what matters. So for example, let's say nuclear weapons. No country would like that another country should have nuclear weapons. Ideally, a country would like that only they should have nuclear weapons. उन्हीं के पास होना चाहिए, right? No other country should have a nuclear weapon, right? But you cannot ensure that other countries don't have nuclear weapons. That's why some countries have nuclear weapons. So among the countries who have nuclear weapons, do you have a preference? So one example is given that the Americans have a problem with North Korea's nuclear program or Iran's nuclear program, but not with United Kingdom's nuclear program. UK के पास भी nuclear weapon है. Theoretically, the nuclear weapon can be used against the US and would have the same impact. Nuclear weapon देख के तो discriminate करेगा नहीं कि this is US. So the purpose is the same. But what is it that makes the difference? The way actors define their identity. So US has much in common in terms of identity with UK, and it has much difference culturally with North Korea or Iran. So that is one example, one way you can look at it, how culture and civilization play a role in making your own identity. And if you have similarity in identity with the other country, it means that in some difficult areas cooperation can be easier. ये समझने का तरीका है, कोई एक simple formula नहीं है इसका. So each area of relation is important for its own purpose. So you generally don't find questions on culture and civilization. ऐसा नहीं होगा कि कल्चर और सिविलाइजेशन पे क्वेश्चन आएगा एग्जाम में, वो आएगा इकोनॉमिक सिक्योरिटी स्ट्रैटेजिक एस्पेक्ट्स को लेकर के ही. बट कल्चर एंड सिविलाइजेशन वुड ऑलवेज बी एन इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट टू मेंशन इन दी आंसर. ये बात आपको समझनी है. सो कल्चर और सिविलाइजेशन इंपॉर्टेंट है और हमारे लिए तो बहुत ही इंपॉर्टेंट है, तभी तो हम इंटरनेशनल योगा डे मनवाना चाहते हैं. ऑलराइट, वी गो टू द यूएन. सो पार्ट ऑफ आइडेंटिटी. Now let's look at the map of Sri Lanka very simply and just understand a few things. So first of all, India and Sri Lanka share a boundary in the Bay of Bengal and through the Park Strait and also here in the Gulf of Mannar. All right. So what is a bay? What is a bay? हाँ, खाड़ी तो हिंदी है, मुझे भी समझ में आ गया. If you have read geography थोड़ा सा, so when you are reading any discipline, you can correlate with other disciplines. What is a bay? एक, any volunteer हाथ खड़ा करके. हाँ, yes. Small water body connecting a big ocean. क्या ये सही है? क्या ये सही है? वो तो स्ट्रेट होगा ना. तो what is a gulf? What is a gulf? What is a bay? What is a strait? हाँ बताइए. which divides two water bodies. What is that? That is a bay. That is a strait. So a passageway connecting two larger water bodies is a strait. तो ये रहा Park Strait, right? Park Strait. ये है Park Bay. This is Park Bay, and this is Gulf of Mannar. So मेरा क्या सजेशन है कि आप घर जाके थोड़ा ज्योग्राफी रिवाइज करके आए और अगली क्लास में मुझे भी बताएं, right? So from the perspective of international relations, we understand that India and Sri Lanka share a maritime boundary. This maritime boundary was demarcated in the year 2000 and in the year 1974. 1974, India and Sri Lanka demarcated their maritime boundary, right? So this is the maritime boundary. This is where you have the maritime boundary, right? This is where it is passing through. Across Bay of Bengal, through the Park Bay. Park Strait is between India and Sri Lanka, and also in the Gulf of Mannar, right? So approximate location. And then 1974 we demarcated our boundary. We further exchanged letters to strengthen cooperation in this regard in 1976, right? So that is one thing, that we share a maritime boundary. Now when we see some locations in Sri Lanka are always in news. They are always in news, right? So for example, if you look at this part of Sri Lanka, Jaffna, Kanke Senthurai, KKS Harbour is here, Kanke Senthurai, right? And then you have places like Mullaitivu or Trincomalee or Batticaloa. They have been in news in terms of what is happening in Sri Lanka. And then you have Colombo, which is the capital of Sri Lanka, Colombo port. 80% of India-bound maritime traffic is serviced by the Colombo port. Colombo port का 80% business जो है वो India specific है. So Colombo port is an important regional port because there is no passageway through the Park Strait, right? There is no passageway through the Park Strait so that ships can move from India's east coast to west coast via this shorter route. So they ultimately go and use the Colombo port. And then you have the different locations in Sri Lanka like Kandy. Kandy is important because there is a temple of Buddha there, right? Temple of Buddha's tooth relic is in Kandy, right? Or those who watch cricket also know Galle. Galle is another location on the coast of Sri Lanka, right? Here is an important Dutch fort in Sri Lanka. And then you have location like Hambantota. उसके बारे में तो सब जानते हैं, राइट? जब भी श्रीलंका के बारे में बात करो एक ही चीज के बारे में लोग बात करते हैं, हम्बनटोटा. ऑलराइट, हम्बनटोटा. एवरीबडी इज इंटेलिजेंट इन आईआर बिकॉज कुछ चीजों को तो सब याद कर सकते हैं. श्रीलंका के बारे में कुछ पूछो, हम्बनटोटा. पाकिस्तान के बारे में कुछ पूछो, टेररिज्म. ऑलराइट, यही है जो अटेंशन ग्रैबिंग चीज है, उसमें आपका ध्यान चला जाता है. एंड देन देयर इज मटारा. सो देन few things that we would remember. Generally we can look at Sri Lanka in terms of its coastline, its coastal region. So there Colombo like cities would become important, and what can be called northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka, and then the central highlands in Sri Lanka, right? So the coastal Sri Lanka, mainly cities like Colombo. Northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. Northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka, why? Because this is where we find the concentration of Tamil population. Of course, around Colombo also there is significant Tamil population, right? Central highlands of Sri Lanka. This is where the coffee and tea plantation, rubber and tea plantation generally in Sri Lanka is located. So why is this important? Because again here you have another Tamil community, right? So in Sri Lanka you have the Tamil community which is called Sri Lankan Tamil community, and another community which is called Indian Tamil community. So northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka, majorly the Sri Lankan Tamil community. What is the difference? These Tamils claim an ancient origin, right? That they have been there in Sri Lanka for thousands of years. They have been there in Sri Lanka for thousands of years. So means that they are equal claimants of rights and privileges in Sri Lanka. The Indian Tamil community is the one which originated during the British period. The Britishers brought Indians to work in plantation agriculture that they promoted in different parts of the world. So the Indian Tamil community, as it is called in Sri Lanka, is of recent origin, dating back from the period of Britishers. All right, dating back from the period of Britishers. So that is basically the geography of Sri Lanka. Northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka important because A, close to India, locations like Jaffna or Kanke Senthurai. B, because this is where you have the major ethnic divide. Sri Lankan Tamil community resides here. And then you have another Tamil community which lives in the central highlands of Sri Lanka, basically brought by the Britishers to work in plantation agriculture. And then locations like Hambantota or Matara, why are they important? Because Hambantota is where the Chinese built a port. That is why it is in news. Chinese built a port. And Matara is where there is an airport, Matala Airport, which again was built through Chinese investments. But India is interested in operating that airport, the Matala Airport as it is called. So this is in simple terms the location of Sri Lanka and why the location is of interest in terms of domestically how Sri Lankan politics is organized, and also externally how other actors are interested in some locations, and also why some ports like Colombo ports are also important for India. Now once we have learned this, what we need to do is we need to go back and learn about the other aspects of the relation, right? So other aspects of relations would mean the other aspects of relations would mean that we talk about the different facets of this relation. So let's do that. So first of all, let's talk about from cultural and civilizational elements. Let's talk about the ethnic issue in India-Sri Lanka relations. The ethnic issue in India-Sri Lanka relations. So first of all, it emerges from shared ethnic linkages. It emerges from shared ethnic linkages between India and Sri Lanka. Mainly, the issue has boiled down to political question of rights of Sri Lankan, political question of rights of Sri Lankan Tamils, right? So this background goes back to post-independence policies, post-independence policies in Sri Lanka, discriminated against the Tamils, discriminated against the Tamils, which means what? So the fundamental factor is that we have a shared ethnicity. Tamils live there, whether Indian Tamils or Sri Lankan Tamils. Sri Lankan Tamils have a strong claim that we equally are the claimants of rights in Sri Lanka because we have ancient roots. In Sri Lanka, the dominant community is the Sinhala community. That is the majority. So then when Sri Lanka became independent, the majority had a view that Tamils were privileged by the British. So that's why Tamils were in a leading position in education and in trade. So that is the perception that the Sinhala community had, that Tamils as minorities were privileged by the British. So thereby, when Sri Lanka became independent, its majority Sinhala leadership then put in place certain policies as part of their own nation building project, and some of these policies were seen to be discriminating against the Tamils. Tamils felt that they are being discriminated against. For example, limiting the voting rights or representation of the Tamils in Sri Lankan politics, disenfranchisement of the Tamils. And second, Sinhala Only Act, or the language policy of Sri Lanka, Sinhala Only Act, which discriminated against the Tamil language. Alright, 1954 Sinhala Only Act. So gradually after independence, the emergence of majoritarian politics in Sri Lanka resulted in the development of ethnic cleavages, ethnic differences, whereby the Tamil community felt that it has been discriminated against. So then what is the way forward? How do you discuss this kind of an issue? How do you discuss this kind of an issue? How do you resolve this kind of an issue? And here is an occasion where you can think of India's own experience. भारत के अपने अनुभव के बारे में सोच सकते हैं आप. क्या है? What is India's own experience? So when we look at our neighborhood, what we find is that most of the countries after their independence faced certain problems which come out of diversity. जब तक अगर आपके देश में एक ही तरह के लोग रहते हैं, एक ही लैंग्वेज बोलते हैं, एक ही रिलीजन फॉलो करते हैं, खैर प्रॉब्लम तब भी आ जाएगी, बिकॉज प्रॉब्लम इज ह्यूमन प्रॉब्लम. ऑलराइट, प्रॉब्लम इज ह्यूमन प्रॉब्लम. प्रॉब्लम इज नॉट रिलीजन, प्रॉब्लम इज नॉट एनीथिंग एल्स, प्रॉब्लम इज ह्यूमन नेचर. ऑलराइट, but still there is a certain cohesiveness, so you may think that it would be easier to implement policies. But when you are diverse, there would be different claims in a democracy. Pakistan faced the same problem. Kaise? When the Bengali speaking population demanded that they be given equal representation, equal rights. Kya kiya Pakistan ne? Pakistan failed. Pakistan failed to accommodate this demand of diversity. And that's why what happened? Bangladesh was created. Bangladesh became independent. Then you have similar demands in Sri Lanka. Alright, similar demands in Sri Lanka. What are Tamils demanding? That Tamil be given equal preference as a language. Their cultural rights, their political rights should be equal with others in Sri Lanka. That is what they are demanding. In India, 1960s, 1950s, what are some of the major questions that India is facing? There is a demand for states, newer states on the basis of identity. Linguistic communities are demanding newer states. There is also a question on what should be India's language. Alright? So there are anti-Hindi rights in Tamil Nadu because it is perceived that Hindi is being imposed. So how did India deal with this problem? So India dealt with this problem through the flexibility of the constitution. Right? We recognize 22 languages as part of our constitution. Right? Then we adopted something called a 3-language formula. That English, Hindi and any other Indian language should be taught or promoted in schools. That is what we did. And then linguistic reorganization of states. So within the federal structure, states have their own rights. So with this we say that we have a political structure or framework through which India addresses the questions of diversity and difference. And remember, no matter who says what, India is a diverse country. Right? India would remain a diverse country. And our constitution is important because it has the ability to accommodate different demands, different communities demanding different things. So largely on the basis of equality, but also addressing differences, if any. When countries fail to do so, it would result in problems. For example, in Nepal, when the constitution was being made, Madhesis, Tharus, Janajatis opposed the provisions of the constitution because they thought that it is not representative, which led to long logjam This happens in politics, this happens in democracy. In Sri Lanka, what happened? So first of all, one thing was that it led to political agitation, meaning Tamil groups coming under one umbrella, forming political organizations demanding their rights. That's one way that our demands should be included in the constitutional scheme of Sri Lanka. When that did not succeed, if peaceful means are allowed to fail, what would happen? There would be inevitably a violent choice. है ना? Isliye it is important that the judiciary delivers justice on time. That justice is not only delivered, but it is seen to be delivered. All right? ऐसा perception कभी create नहीं होना चाहिए कि constitution is not working, or the judiciary is not working, or the parliament is not working. That's why institutions are important. So the political agitation led to limited results. So thereby what you would see is there is also creation of violent militant groups like LTTE. So every political question would have two sides. One side would prefer peaceful negotiations, आराम से बात कर लेते हैं, आराम से बात करके सॉल्व करते हैं. दूसरा साइड कहेगा नहीं, एक्शन चाहिए, we want action. It happens. So the LTTE, Liberation Tigers for the Tamil Eelam, is created for the purpose of establishing an independent Tamil state in the northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. Now what they are saying, earlier generation of political activists, political leaders are saying, no, not an independent state, but our rights should be recognized. Now LTT is saying that nothing doing, the solution is creation of a separate Tamil state in the northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka then plunges into a civil war-like situation. 1970s onwards, what you would see is Sri Lanka has many domestic cleavages or fault lines. One is the leftist insurgency in Sri Lanka, another is the Tamil insurgency in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka is facing a threat to its territorial integrity and threat to its sovereignty. So what has been Government of India's role in this context? So just understand that whenever the issue of treatment of Sri Lankans, treatment of Tamils in Sri Lanka arises, it becomes a sensitive issue in India. Why? Because India is a federal state in which Tamil Nadu is an important state, right? So the people of Tamil Nadu feel emotionally connected with the Tamils in Sri Lanka. So for them it is an important issue. So in Tamil Nadu's politics, this has been an important issue. And the Tamil regional parties like the DMK or the AIDMK have in different phases been an important part of coalition governments at the center. So then that demand also is a demand on India's foreign policy, that India should be doing something, right? So India's foreign policy always has contended with the dilemma of how to sufficiently address the concerns regarding Tamil rights in Sri Lanka while also respecting Sri Lanka's sovereignty and territorial integrity, as well as maintaining good relations with Sri Lanka. कैसे अच्छे संबंध रखें, कहीं पे भी सोवरेनिटी और टेरिटोरियल इंटीग्रिटी क्वेश्चन न करे श्रीलंका की, और साथ में जो तमिल इशू है उसको भी ठीक से एड्रेस करें. दैट इज व्हाट इंडियाज dilemma in Sri Lanka has been, right? So thereby you would see that two approaches have been there. One is to talk to Sri Lanka, all right? One is to talk to Sri Lanka, conveying to it that a political solution is required and we would assist you. Another is, some people would say, for example, whenever Sri Lanka has not listened, India has utilized coercive tactics also. For example, some people argue that LTTE in its creation was assisted by India's intelligence agencies initially. Some people argue that right? That LTT in its creation was held by India's intelligence agencies. They trained in India, right? Now, fundamentally what is India's preference is that no matter what, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of any country should not be questioned. So any solution which questions the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any country is not acceptable to India. So thereby what we see is that India has been closely engaged. India has been closely engaged with the Tamil question. India has been closely engaged with the Tamil question in Sri Lanka, right? And that has resulted in certain ways of dealing with the issue. So India has supported the resolution of the ethnic issue, resolution of the ethnic issue within the constitutional framework of Sri Lanka. That's number one, that we are interested in resolution of the Tamil question, but our way is that we have suggested that it should be resolved within the constitutional framework of Sri Lanka. India also has advocated that any solution should be mindful of or respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity, sovereignty and territorial integrity. Any solution must ensure respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka. That means any solution that involves a separate state is not supported by India. India supports that the Tamil issue should be sensitively dealt with, and it advises Sri Lanka to do so. India's preference is for constitutional framework of Sri Lanka, and any solution which goes against the territorial sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka is not acceptable to India. That is something that India has not supported. Similarly, India has supported the right of Sri Lankan government to act against terrorism, meaning if Sri Lankan government decided to act against violence of LTTE, India has not said that don't do so, right? So then this is basically, these are the three main planks of India's position on the issue. One, India has been engaged with the Tamil question. There is no question that India has not talked about it. So it conveys to the Sri Lankan partners government that resolve this issue. अच्छा होगा हम दोनों के लिए, once and for all. How should this issue be resolved? Within the constitutional framework of Sri Lanka. What kind of solutions are not advocated by India? Solutions going against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sri Lanka. That means if LTTE demands a separate state, that is something that India is not going to support. Similarly, if LTTE or any such group gets involved in violence against the state, again being a state itself, India does not support that. It supports the right of the other government to take action against the terrorist. So thereby, in this process of India's engagement with Sri Lanka, we find major milestones have been 1987 India Sri Lanka Peace Accord. India Sri Lanka peace accord led to a the constitutional formula of what is called 13th amendment. That is India's suggestion that amendment could be made to Sri Lanka's constitution, 13th amendment. And then immediately at that point in time, India also decided to support the peace process by ensuring that the combatants are separated. So India decided to send IPKF, Indian Peacekeeping Forces, under what is called Operation Pawan. In many of the batches, students used to suggest movies like Madras Cafe. All right, Madras Cafe. It is on Sri Lankan civil war and India's involvement. अगर किसी का सिनेमा देखने में इंटरेस्ट है, so you can watch Madras Cafe. Now, so basically, the 13th Amendment is the political solution. It talks about devolution of power to provinces. That by providing greater power to provinces, this problem can be resolved. Devolution of power to provinces, right? It calls for greater cultural and political rights to the Tamils. Greater political and cultural rights to the Tamils. That is what mainly the 13th Amendment or 13A as it is sometimes mentioned focuses on. That this is the solution. It also means in some ways merger of those areas which are dominated by Tamils. Merger of northern and eastern provinces. Meaning it's in some ways is putting forward the idea of autonomy for the Tamils in certain matters. All right, devolution of powers to provinces in the matter of police, in the matter of land, right? So that would satisfy the Tamil demand if such a power is available to a unified province of northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. जैसे केजरीवाल जी डिमांड करते रहते हैं, क्या डिमांड कर रहे हैं? Police, land should be devolved. Right? So that is the solution that India is suggesting, 13th Amendment. Devolution of powers to provinces, provision for cultural and political rights of the Tamils in the constitution, merger of northern and eastern provinces in Sri Lanka. That is 13th Amendment in Sri Lanka's constitution. That is something that India supports. So even today, what is India's solution to Sri Lanka's Tamil issue? That 13th Amendment should be implemented in word and spirit. That's the solution. So whenever there is a conversation between India and Sri Lanka, prime ministers meet each other or foreign ministers meet each other, India would emphasize that the solution is political, solution lies in the implementation of 13th Amendment. Sending of IPKF was an immediate step. Right, so there have been some chapters in India's history when India has decided to play a decisive role in its neighborhood. So at that point in time, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister. And as a young Prime Minister, he thought that India can play a decisive role in the neighborhood. So that is why you would see 1988, our armed forces went to Maldives to save the government there. And then we sent our armed forces to Sri Lanka. So what was happening at this point in time was how this particular agreement came into picture, that this was an particularly intense phase of civil war in Sri Lanka, where LTTE was attacking Sri Lankan armed forces and Sri Lankan armed forces had embargoed certain parts of northern Sri Lanka. So the civilian population suffers in this scenario. In the fight between LTTE and the military, the civilian people were suffering. So India asked Sri Lanka to remove the embargo so that supplies can be maintained to the civilian population. When Sri Lankan government did not listen, Indian Air Force airdropped food supplies in the northern areas. All right, हमने food supply वहाँ पे airdrop किया. But this is not a tenable situation. You cannot continuously keep on doing that. है ना कि आप एक देश के अंदर एयर ड्रॉप कर रहे हैं supplies. So then the idea was, if there is a political solution, then it would resolve this problem once and for all. So the Prime Minister, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, and then President of Sri Lanka, J.R. Jayawardene, that is why it is also called Rajiv Gandhi Jayawardene Accord, India also talked with the leadership of LTTE, and it convinced the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE to enter into a peaceful understanding. And that is where India suggested that Tamil demand can be met through constitutional amendment. And then the next process was, since the LTTE and the Sri Lankan army had been fighting for a very long time, India suggested that LTTE lays down its arms. LTTE did not trust the Sri Lankan army. So then India ensured that for the period till which LTTE lays down its arms and is then integrated in the political process in Sri Lanka, Indian armed forces would play a neutral arbiter. They would separate the combatants, they would ensure that there is no fighting, there is no violation of the agreement. We had an understanding that the LTTE leader, Vellupillai Prabhakaran, would ensure that LTTE lays down arms, and the Sri Lankan government would ensure that there is fair treatment to Tamils. So what happened was that the intent can be good, but the outcomes do not always follow the intent. There is something called unintended consequences. आप सोच कुछ सकते हैं जीवन में और हो कुछ और सकता है. So much of history is about unintended consequences. For example, when Mikhail Gorbachev decided Glasnost and Perestroika, सुना होगा आपने, opening up, he was not imagining that it would lead to the collapse of Soviet Union. उनका उद्देश्य जो है वो सोवियत यूनियन का कोलैप्स कराना नहीं था. But ultimately what happened? As Glasnost and Perestroika opened up the space for dissent in USSR, the major political fault lines opened up, right? And then ultimately it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So बेचारे Gorbachev, who wanted to create a pressure valve to release some pressure from the Soviet system, ultimately presided over the collapse of the Soviet system. So similarly, India at that point in time thought that it has cracked the formula for resolution of this difficult issue, जिससे पड़ोसी देश में प्रॉब्लम भी सॉल्व हो जाएगी. Principles like sovereignty, territorial integrity would also be supported, right? And also, if you are able to resolve problems in your neighborhood, then there is unquestionable leadership, कि आप capable हैं सॉल्व करने के प्रॉब्लम को, right? तो पर हिस्ट्री में ऐसा नहीं हुआ. What happened was this. Soon the agreement became unpopular in Sri Lanka. Both LTTE and Sri Lankan government violated the understanding, right? One, Mr. J.R. Jayawardene lost the election. So Mr. Premadasa became the president of Sri Lanka, and Mr. Premadasa did not like the agreement. So Sri Lankan government in a way pulled away its support from the agreement. The president with whom we had signed it was no longer in power. And the LTTE accused the Sri Lankan government of not following what was agreed upon. So then they also started violence. So in this, what happened was, the IPKF, which was only there for peacekeeping. Peacekeeping का मतलब लड़ाई लड़ना नहीं होता. Peacekeeping का मतलब होता है ये इंश्योर करना कि जो दो झगड़ा कर रहे हैं उनके बीच में आप हैं, है ना, उनको आपने अलग करके रखा हुआ है. Now the Indian peacekeeping forces were attacked. They were facing attack and they were fighting a battle there. So they were there in unknown terrain. They were there with a mission which the Indian military was fulfilling for the first time. It was a new experience. So the lack of knowledge of the terrain, the political situation in Sri Lanka meant that the IPKF was caught in the crossfire between Sri Lankan government and the LTTE. उन दोनों की लड़ाई में the Indian armed forces were caught. So it resulted in significant casualties of the Indian peacekeeping forces. So ultimately, this did not unfold as it was intended to. Operation Pawan ultimately proved to be a disaster, right? But this particular solution is still the preferred solution for India, right? So IPKF was disbanded in 1990. We brought back our soldiers, and then what happened was in 1991 we saw the assassination of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, in an election rally in Sri Perumbudur was attacked by a human bomber from LTTE, right? So ये जो human bombing है ये master किया था किसने? LTTE वालों ने. LTTE became the pioneer of suicide bombing. All right. So the killing of Mr. Rajiv Gandhi then meant that India's position on LTTE became further stringent. It became further clear that there is no question that India would support the LTTE. India supported the right of the Sri Lankan government to take action against the terrorist activities of the LTTE, right? So that is something that happened in the past. So then what we see is that this is a feature which played out in Sri Lanka's politics for a very long time. For example, now we see 2006 to 2009 is another phase of civil war in Sri Lanka. So in between what happens? A, there would be direct fighting between the LTTE and the Sri Lankan armed forces, or there would be suicide bombings carried out by LTTE. So LTTE used suicide bombing and used it against civilians, unfortunately also. And then there were attempts by governments like government of Norway. The Norway government also mediated between LTTE and Sri Lankan government. So there were efforts to find a peaceful solution, but there was also continuous fighting, either through suicide bombing or through direct fight between the armed forces of both countries. The decisive phase came in 2006 to 2009. What happened? Sri Lanka elected a nationalist president, Mahinda Rajapaksa. So those who call themselves nationalists would always talk about security. कि हम क्या करेंगे? Security ensure करेंगे. So then Mahinda Rajapaksa adopted the tactics of a direct fight with the LTTE. So now the armed forces of Sri Lanka, so पहले क्या होता था? Aerial bombing और दूर से आप लड़ रहे हैं. Now the Sri Lankan army decided to go inside the stronghold of LTTE in the northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. So this was a decisive phase of fighting. So by 2019, what happened was LTTE was defeated. LTTE was defeated, and V. Prabhakaran, who was the leader of the LTTE, was killed in the fighting. So these two things happen. So on the one hand, Sri Lanka succeeded in defeating the LTTE, and then the dismantling of LTTE as an organization. Much of its leadership was wiped out or later apprehended, arrested. But then what happened was, in the same period, the civil war witnessed human rights violations. जहां पे भी armed operations चल रहे हैं, वहां पे ये खतरा हमेशा बना रहता है. Because once you fire a piece of artillery or you fire a weapon, it does not discriminate between good people and bad people. है ना? There is no bullet, आज तक ऐसी गोली नहीं बनी जो ये discriminate कर पाए कि कौन civilian है और कौन combatant है. All right. So there was human rights violation. So that also meant there was large scale displacement of Tamil people from northern and eastern parts of Sri Lanka. This became an international issue. This also became a domestic issue. So, as India had faced the choice of intervening and resolving the issue in Sri Lanka earlier, now India was faced with responding to what is happening. So on the one hand, Indian government provided support to Sri Lanka in their fight against the LTTE. They did not at least prevent them from fighting. On the other hand, when civilians were killed or displaced, there was significant anger in Tamil Nadu. So at that point in time, 2006, 2009, UPA is in power and DMK is an important part of the coalition. So you would see at that point in time, the leader of DMK, Mr. Karunanidhi, sat on a hunger strike, a brief hunger strike, demanding action against Sri Lanka. So again, the Indian government faces the issue of how to respond. There is a domestic demand and there is also concern for relations with Sri Lanka, right? So thereby what you would see is, while India did not oppose Sri Lanka's action against LTTE, because LTTE was a terrorist group for India, which posed a threat to security of Sri Lanka. On the issue of human rights violation, India voted in UN Human Rights Council supporting such resolutions calling for an international probe in human rights violation during the civil war of Sri Lanka, right? United States, European countries had proposed resolution which called for international probe, international investigation into human rights violation during the civil war. So Sri Lanka of course wanted India to oppose such resolutions. Why? Because just as India says that if anyone is making a comment on India's issues, it is interfering in India's domestic affairs. Sri Lanka said that if there has to be an investigation, we will do it on our own. But international community insisted that there should be an international probe. This issue was discussed at Human Rights Council and there was a vote. And India, more than on one occasion, voted in favor of such resolutions. What resolutions? Resolutions calling for international probe into human rights violation during the civil war. So that is what India did. So now here you would see, would the government of Sri Lanka like this? No. So obviously this became an issue of friction again, right? So Tamil issue is one issue where domestic policy and foreign policy seem to be intertwined. Domestic public opinion in India, domestic public and political opinion in Sri Lanka on this issue are an important factor in terms of the history of their foreign relations. So India voted in favor of UN Human Rights Council resolutions. So obviously this is a period of friction in this relation. So thereby what you would see is the episode saw a greater role of China in Sri Lanka after this particular period, right? So whenever we have troubles in our relations with any of our neighbor, what will happen? China would have an opportunity. So China provided arms to Sri Lanka during the civil war period. China provided arms to Sri Lanka, and then the Sri Lankan government opened up its economy for China financed projects. So that's why you would see one such project is 2010 Hambantota Port project. All right, Hambantota Port project is a product of this period in which Sri Lanka had greater receptivity towards China. Why? Because it had frictions in relations with India. That India asks questions on human rights. हमको पसंद नहीं है. Right? China does not ask any question. What kind of rule you have? What kind of government you have? What is your stand on human rights? आप क्या सोचते हैं? नहीं. China does not care. Right? China. So any strong authoritarian government would find it easier to interact with China. So be that as it may, the opportunity for change in any relation is always there. कुछ भी पत्थर पे नहीं लिखा हुआ है, पत्थर पे लकीर नहीं खींची हुई है. So the change happened. How did the change happen? In 2014, the government in India changed. In 2015, the government in Sri Lanka changed. Change in government. So then, what would you see? Mahinda Rajapaksa was defeated in Sri Lanka. Matripala Sirisena became the president. And in India, the UPA government was voted out and NDA government came into power. So अब क्या दोनों तरफ नए लोग हैं, है ना? तो कम से कम ये कह सकते हैं कि भाई वो तो पुराने लोगों ने किया था, अब हम नया रिश्ता बनाते हैं, right? So this change is an opportunity where India and Sri Lanka decide to move beyond the recent stage in their relationship. So change is an opportunity. So government changes. So what you would see is this period is marked by high-level visits on both sides. Prime Minister Modi visits Sri Lanka, right? And for example, we jointly underline that we have much in similar, much in common. So then, since then, the focus of relations has been on improving economic cooperation, improving development cooperation as a major part of it, improving security cooperation, and focusing on cultural ties. Meaning, in one way what has happened is that political issues like the issue of the Tamil rights in Sri Lanka for a while went to the or were put on the back burner, right? Because abhi civil war khatam hua hai, there is no LTTE, so this issue is not a major issue. So let's cooperate on other issues: economic cooperation, development cooperation, security cooperation, and cultural cooperation. So that is what India and Sri Lanka have been trying to do. But then what you would see is that again there is a change. 2019 and 2020. What is change? Sri Lanka chooses a new president and also a new prime minister. So who is the president and who is the prime minister? Again, Mahinda Rajapaksa's brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa becomes the president, and later 2019 Gotabaya Rajapaksa becomes the president, and 2019 Mahinda Rajapaksa becomes the prime minister. So again there is a change in government. So now, recalling the nature of relations during this period, it was argued or speculated that this government would further favor China over India. All right, that was speculated, right? So under the Gotabaya Rajapaksa presidency, what we see is that there is a visit of the president to India, and then 2020 summit of prime ministers. 2020 summit of the prime ministers take place, and this summit talks about Mitratva Magga, meaning the path of friendship, Mitratva Marg. That is the title of their joint statement which was issued. So on the one hand, there is a traditional understanding that under the rule of the Rajapaksa family, China is a preferred partner and relations with India suffer. On the other hand, it is also true that Sri Lanka cannot afford to ignore India,
because India is geographically the closest major power that Sri Lanka has. So simultaneously, just understand there would be issues of friction, and then you cannot also deny the fundamentals of relations. So focus is on cooperation. So in this area, what kind of cooperation do we see? So we see in India-Sri Lanka relations, trade governed by the Free Trade Agreement of 2020. Now India remains the largest trading partner of, barring a few years, partner of Sri Lanka. 2021-22 you find trade to be more than 6 billion US dollars. 6 billion US dollars. India's FDI in Sri Lanka is around 2 billion US dollars. 2 billion US dollars. So this has been the focus in relation. Trade has to increase because India is the nearest large economy for Sri Lanka. So for example, import of petroleum in Sri Lanka is majorly from India. Their energy resources are coming from India. Medicines are coming from India. Certain agricultural commodities are coming from India. So trade remains important, right? That is the fundamental reality. We have a free trade agreement. Trade stood at around more than 6 billion US dollars and FDI around 2 billion US dollars, right? However, there was an attempt to expand the free trade agreement, and that attempt has not been successful. India and Sri Lanka were negotiating expansion of negotiations on ETCA, Economic and Technical Cooperation Agreement, which was basically aiming at expanding the FTA to include services and investments under its purview. So the negotiations on ETCA did not succeed. So while what we see is traditional cooperation goes on, it becomes difficult in these kind of phases to expand the relation qualitatively. So ETCA did not succeed. Then if we look at the area of development partnership, here again we find that no matter differences on political issues, this is an important flank of the relation. So India has committed more than 3 billion US dollars as development assistance to Sri Lanka, meaning India is still a large development partner of Sri Lanka. So here you would see major examples of what India did was, so the major example is 50,000 housing units for the internally displaced people in Sri Lanka, meaning those people who were displaced after क्लास के बाद मिलिए, अब जरा मुझे बताइए क्या मजाक चल रहा है आप लोगों के बीच में. So who were displaced during the civil war, for them India built a housing project, right? 50,000 housing units are built by India. So generally you would see building of housing units is a key part of what India does in the neighborhood. In Nepal also we have built 50,000 housing units. In Sri Lanka also we have built 50,000 housing units. Similarly, the money went to infrastructure augmentation. So for example, improvement of railways in Sri Lanka. So that is where you find money is going. But also India is supporting cultural projects in northern Sri Lanka. That is what India is doing, meaning restoration of certain temples, right? India has supported building of agricultural centers. India has supported building of IT centers. India has supported building of language training centers. So in this way, India has consistently made an attempt to establish itself as a credible development partner of Sri Lanka. It is part of our image, right? That we stand for mutual benefit. Sri Lanka needs development support. We are providing whatever we can. $3 billion of development assistance to Sri Lanka. All right. So that is what we have done so far in terms of development assistance, and it continues. Even now in this year, if you will find, किसी ने कुछ कहा? So even now what you will find is that this year, the story that we will continue in the next class, when Sri Lanka faced a special crisis, an economic crisis, again India, what is it that India chose to do? India chose to provide assistance to Sri Lanka, currency swap or supporting the import through line of credit. That is what India has done. So in the next class what we will be doing is, we will be moving forward with Sri Lanka and specifically what has happened in the current period. We will look at other examples of security cooperation, right? And then we will talk about Maldives, and then the other thing that we will be doing is, we will be talking about SAARC and BIMSTEC. SAARC and BIMSTEC. So that is what we are going to do in the next class.